will you tell me about the process of your book? Like, which is this particular book, unless you want to maybe start talking about your process for poems in general, and then maybe talk about like how you got this book to be existing in the world.
I feel like I've been doing this for long enough, or at least I've been passionate about it long enough that I should have my process laid down, but I don't. I think, so Void and Compensation, which is my book, I've been working on these poems, or they're poems in this book that are pretty old. I mean, I hear a lot of poets say, well, I was working on this book for 5 years before it came out, and I'm sort of like, that's nothing. That feels like a blip. I mean, some of the poems in Void and Compensation are probably 15 years old, or at least they're parts of poems that were in previous drafts. But I think that project started about 12 years ago in earnest, when I was married and my marriage was ending. And I sort of knew it was ending, but in that emotional space where you're still trying to save something and it's slipping away a little bit. I think that sort of was one of the things that kickstarted this project of dealing with loss, how one deals with loss, how one compensates for losing things, and I think I'm without being, it's not as anxious and anxiety prone, but I think there's this constant low level sense for me of loss being something that drives me to write, to save things, to swim against a tide of time, and maybe to reverse things, not necessarily to keep those things, but to feel like there's some sense of individual control, or a little bit of control, or a little bit of a slowing down of time, so that one can feel as though they have a grip and a grasp of all the chaos and all the change and all the shifting that goes on in one's life, both individually and collectively. So the marriage ending was one thing that I think prompted some of the poems in the book. Losing my mother, which happened in my early 20s, but which I often didn't really write about until later, I think comes into play. Making choices about relationships enters into the book, and I think that the poems in the book end up becoming almost engagements with and rehearsals for loss, because I think I always have the sense that some sort of loss and change is coming. And it's both dealing with things that you have lost and maybe girding oneself for the sense that things will continue to change and losses will continue to mount. And it's not totally cynical. I mean, I know that there are things that are gained as well. And there's a part of me that's very good about being present in particular moments and enjoying things, simple things. But there's always, like I mentioned, that low-level sense of things are going to change, and how does one sort of deal with change and loss? And the poetry is, I think, sort of a response to that. It feels like a response to that. That said, in terms of process and generating things, I think that much of the time I have to find back doors to get to subject matter. I like to sort of... It's serious play, but it's play. I mean, it's sitting down, and I don't necessarily feel like I sit down with a topic or an agenda of what I'm actually going to do. I actually will have to sort of fool myself towards my subject matter, and that might be picking 7 or 8 random words out of different articles from the particular newspaper of that day, or if I'm online, sort of looking at articles and picking 7 or 8 words that I love and giving myself 5 minutes to write as much as I can and having to include those words, occupying a part of the brain that feels more playful or game-like in order to get a draft down. And then I think as I go back to particular rough drafts, then the larger concerns, in the case of Void and Compensation, dealing with loss and elegy and things like that, I think those things come to the surface. I end up moving towards a subject matter, but I think I like to be more playful in terms of the actual music or the language that I use to get there, if that makes sense. So, and at least in process-wise, I like to write longhand. even though my handwriting is atrocious, and sometimes it's hard to go back and type it up afterwards, but it's this very sort of painstaking process of writing things out by hand and then going and typing them up and then going back and editing and revising. And often, Catherine Barnett is a poet I love. She's a dear friend of mine, and she's also a contemporary poet whose work I admire, and she's a great friend and a great editor, and I thought of her because I was thinking process-wise, I often write from margin to margin when I do longhand, or if I'm typing and I'm composing on a computer, I type from left margin to right margin. I'm not aware of lines as such when I'm doing my initial compositions. And she said, well, but you also, and she works with me. Sometimes we'll go to a cafe and we'll write together and we'll read each other what we're doing. And I think she thinks that I have this sense of music in my head and a sense of lineation in my head that she can hear even if I'm reading something that feels like prose as a draft. So maybe that's something that's, a music that's in my head. There's a pentameter music, loose pentameter, a loose blank verse music that fills the book, and I think that I arrive at that. But in process, literally, I write from margin to margin, and then I go back and I worry about the line and units of measure and sound and things like that. So,
have you ever written any prose poems, or have you ventured to play in that way, or are you really obsessed or engaged mostly with lyrical?
I mean, I feel like prose poems can be, or are lyric poems, and I love their music. I love teaching them. I love, I love hybridity and how it's sort of, oh my God, what is this thing? Who cares, in some sense, right? I mean, that's also the teacher part of me and the writer part of me that sort of butt heads. It's like, well, teachers, we'd like to be able to sort of classify things, but no, I mean, it's so you present prose poems to kids and they're like, what is this? It's not a poem, it's not, well, it's both. And there's something that's delightful about that. I've done some fiction and some prose poetry, but I think I love the line. I mean, that's the kind of thing, and I love music, and that's the thing that I think I keep coming back to. So in terms of being a poet, I'm not going to say that you can only write poetry in lines, but for me, for whatever reason, that's the thing that I keep coming back to, that I'm sort of passionate about and feel, that feels essential to me, that's the unit of construction in a lyric poem for me. And so I love prose poems. But I find that when I end up writing, more often than not, I'm interested in taking something and putting it into a line, which there's something other than the syntax of a sentence that's at work in how somebody's going to give voice to or take voice from a particular piece of writing. So,
what music then? I mean, it's sort of an easy segue, but what music then inspires you, or maybe not inspires you, but like, what kind of music do you enjoy most and that you hear in your head and that sticks with you?
Again, I think for whatever reason, in Void and Compensation, I think a lot of the work has this loose kind of... there's only one super formal poem in the book. It's called Second in Command, and it's a bout rimé. It's sort of a French form, and it's... there are rhymes, and that's the one sort of classic formal poem in the book. But I think even though it's free verse poetry, there is this sort of ghost or loose guiding principle of a pentameter line somehow that enters into that colors the book, and so I think that's there. But there's not one overarching music, I think, that feels that I'm obsessively attached to. I'm sort of laughing because I'm thinking like that. There's a really dumb DirecTV commercial that's out right now with the former football star Randy Moss, who is a wide receiver, and there's sort of like DirecTV has this ad campaign where they sort of have some famous sports figure. There's the real person, then there's the other version of that person who doesn't have DirecTV and is a lesser human being because of it. And the lesser Randy Moss is in a grocery store, and he says this line where he says, "I hate it when they put the Fruity Munch on the top shelf," and it kills me, it cracks me up, but also there's something musical about that, right? Where you have these two stresses where I hate it when they put the fruity munch, and the fruity munch gets emphasized, on the top shelf. Stupid, ridiculous music that's in everyday colloquial speech is the thing that I love. And I'm constantly writing crap down in notebooks, that I overhear. And now I do it on my phone. I'll like be on the subway and I'll like be punching in something that's overheard. But that's the music that I'm obsessed with. And that, to me, it seems like a far cry to then go back to somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins, but with his music and with his sprung rhythm and his emphasis on sound, and the sound being as important as the content and the meaning of what's going on, that's always been like the guiding principle. And sometimes, to a fault. I think that sometimes, maybe it took me so long to publish a book because there's a certain clarity that's lacking in my work because I might be more obsessed with sound and a density of thinking and meditation that isn't as linear or clear-cut, and maybe sometimes makes for a poetry that's not as sort of straightforward and linear. And I don't know. So those things come into